Good evening. My name is Ross Maher of District 55, and Representative Corvese is my representative. I am a proponent of passing this resolution calling for a convention of the states for the purposes of developing proposals for ratification as amendments to the U.S. Constitution. As stated, there are three topical areas that Rep. Corvese just mentioned, and as so, the convention is so limited to reducing the size and scope of the federal government, imposing fiscal restraints on the federal government, and imposing term limits on our federal officials to include members of Congress. And this year, we've taken somewhat of a different path, as Rep. Corvese alluded to, and we've really combined two resolutions into one. The first part being the portion which calls for the convention and cites the limited topical areas, and the second lays out more procedures as to how our state would select its commissioners, starts to place initial limitations on them and prevents them from going beyond their scope while attending the convention, as well as addresses some recall procedures as well for attempts to go beyond their commission. So from this point, I'm briefly just going to focus on the concerns or some of the more common concerns that we see from our opponents for calling the Convention of States. First and foremost is the infamous runaway convention. Frankly, this is historically inaccurate. There's no such thing. There has never been a runaway convention, and it's an utter myth. The founders that attended the Philadelphia Convention, commonly cited as the example of the runaway convention, had written commissions from their states allowing them to address the needs and the exigencies of the Union, the inadequacies of the Articles of Confederation, and they did so without restriction. Further, had the delegates gone beyond their authority, beyond their commission, the resulting Constitution would have failed the ratification process, which obviously it has not. Our opponents also cite the resulting constitutional chaos. This is impossible because we seek to use the constitutional methods for making amendments. And these are the same procedures that every amendment that we cherish today have adhered to. So how is this constitutional chaos? And since Congress has or repeatedly fails to restrain itself, the states are the only remaining option. And to quote my friend, Mr. Marion, if you don't like the regulation, change it. The irony, the self-licking ice cream cone in all this, the circular argument is you then have to use Article 5 in order to be able to change Article 5. With that, often people ask or they throw their arms up and they scream and hoot and holler as to how a convention would run. And frankly, the convention would run like every other legislative process throughout this nation, with the processes that the commissioners are familiar with, as laid out in Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedures, which is the very procedural guide that this very legislature uses on a daily basis. And most interestingly, as we watched how today's meeting opened up, the procedures that you used to move us into this agenda are laid out in Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedure. Lastly is going beyond the scope of the resolutions. There are numerous control measures to prevent this. First, the resolution itself restricts the topics and points of debate. Congress itself is a natural adversary to a convention of the states, and the easiest way to invalidate that convention is for violating the scope that is written into the resolutions. Next, the states would be required to produce a commission for their commissioners, articulating their restrictions, their limitations on their commission, and as well cause for a recall. And then lastly, penalizing the commissioners for attempts to go beyond their scope or otherwise undermine the purposes of the convention. Several other states have implemented civil and/or criminal penalties for violating their commission, and I would recommend that Rhode Island implement very similar and stringent penalties. The last thing that I want to say before I answer your questions, assuming that you have them, is that I want to emphasize that the ratification process remains unchanged, regardless of whether the U.S. Congress started a convention or the state started a convention. Ultimately, the states have the final say as to yes or no on each individual proposal.